This podcast is produced by the Harwood Productions Podcast Network. To learn more about the network and to find more of our shows, visit us online at www.harwoodpodcast.com.
Hi, I'm Cindy Harris. Welcome to the Photography Guild. This month we're going to be talking about depth of field and aperture. Aperture is just one of the points on the photography triangle. ISO and shutter speed are the other 2 points, and we'll be talking about those in future episodes. So when we're talking about aperture and depth of field, we're really asking how much of our photo do we want to be in focus? Well, it all depends. In this hibiscus, I wanted that very tip of the stamen to be in focus, but the rest blurred out. And that's where aperture comes in. Aperture controls how much light gets in. It's like the iris of your eye. It opens to let more light in and it closes to let less light in. And that's where our camera lenses come in. Our camera lens will open up to have a large aperture and lots of light, or it will close up to have a small aperture or less light. And the number that we assign to aperture is called the f-stop. So if you have lots of light coming in, you have an f-stop of 2. Less light would be an f-stop of 32. So that's why I like to think of f-stops like fractions. An f-stop of 2, I always think of it like 1/2, whereas an f-stop of 32 is like 1/32. 1/2 is bigger than 1/32. So if it's a small number, it's actually a larger amount of light. So let's talk about depth of field. Now this is a photo I took of some Icelandic poppies, and this photo has a shallow depth of field. If you'll notice, the area in front is in sharp focus, and as you look back into the photo, it gets blurrier. You can get a shallow depth of field in a photograph by shooting at a fairly low f-stop. I shot this at an f-stop of 4. And what it does is it helps the subject in the front separate from the background. You can imagine if this all was in focus, there would be a lot of clutter in this picture. So by having a lot of light come in at having a low f-stop, I can really isolate that front flower from the ones in the back. Now in this photo, you can see I shot it at a higher f-stop of 29, and with this you get this longer, deeper depth of field. Everything is in focus. Sometimes you do want that in a photograph. And the way you achieve that is stopping up, which means you're limiting how much light gets in through the lens. This was a really fun experiment. I went in my front yard and I found a flower. And what I did is I sat in one place and I took 3 different shots, and the only thing that changed was the aperture. Now on the photo on the top left, I shot that with a shallow depth of field. I was stopped at only about 2.8. And you'll notice I get the tip of the flower in perfect clarity, and then it blurs out as it goes towards the back. So on this one, I had a lot of light coming in, and I liked how that white was balanced in the back of it. I thought that was kind of neat. In the second photo to the right, I went to a medium depth of field. It was stopped up to about 8. And on the last one, I stopped it all the way up at 32. Not much light, everything is in focus, and it was just such a startling contrast to shoot the same thing, but at 3 different stops. So then I put on my telephoto lens and I shot up into an evergreen pear tree. And all I did, I stood in the same spot, just changed the aperture settings, and you can just see such a difference. The f4 shot is very pastel-y and blurry. The clarity a little bit more as we stop it up to 8. Even more so at 14, and then at 32, everything is in focus. What was interesting to me is to see in the f4 shot, those shadows in the background really were those part of the branches in the background of the f-stop 32 photo. So then that brings me to backgrounds. When you are playing with depth of field, backgrounds are very important. Now in this first shot of this little pea shoot, I had a white flower in the background, but it's so blurred out you can't tell what it is. Second shot, I had a pink and yellow rose, and it just brought such a watercolory background to it. It was perfect against that green leaf with all the water droplets on it. Here are a couple more examples. The photo on the left, that's a pumpkin in the background when I'm shooting through some corn silk. And on the right, that's a plumeria that had this kind of sword fern behind it, but in between the blades of the fern, you could see the blue sky. It just was a stunning shot, I thought. So let's say you have a point and shoot camera. Well, I have one of those too, and so here's an example. The photo on the left was of a fern I have growing in my backyard, and I just stood up, pointed, and shot, and that's what I got. Everything was in focus. The camera took care of the aperture for me. Now I wanted to kind of trick the camera a little bit. So what I did is I put it in the macro setting, which is like the flower symbol. You could also go into the portrait symbol if you have that. I zoomed in and I got as close to the fern as I could without it going too out of focus all over. And then I did pre-focus. Now pre-focus is really important on a point and shoot camera. It's where you press the shutter about halfway down and you'll see kind of a little box comes up in your viewfinder and it kind of locks the focus in. When you do that and then press the shutter, you can see in the second photo I actually was able to get a little bit of shallow depth of field going on. See those little seeds on that fern there in the front? Well, there's no way you get that kind of detail with just pointing and shooting, but you can kind of trick your camera a little bit and give yourself a little bit more interesting shot. So then I got out my SLR camera and I put it on aperture mode. Now what that means is I'm controlling the aperture, but I'm letting the camera handle the shutter speed and the ISO. So I stood in front of a camellia and I did one shot with a very low aperture of 2, so a lot of light, and I got a little bit of clarity and a lot of blur. And then in the second shot, I cranked it all the way up to 32, and you can see I got tons of clarity. And this is an example for me of a shot that looks very cluttered. So our assignment this month is to photograph something that has a shallow and a deep depth of field. So it doesn't matter what kind of camera you have, first find a fixed subject, something that doesn't move too much, like a flower or a tree limb or a bird bath. Then, if you have a point and shoot camera, start by getting your deep depth of field shot. Basically just finding your subject and pointing and shooting it. Then, let's try to trick the camera and get a shallow depth of field shot. Put your camera on the macro or portrait setting, get close to your subject and zoom in as far as you can, and then pre-focus and see what you get. For those of you with SLR cameras, you're just going to take a subject and the only thing you're going to do is change your aperture settings. So you'll start by getting a shallow depth of field shot by stopping it down as far as you can, maybe an f2 or an f4. Then stop up at mid-range, like about an f8, f10, and then stop up as far as you can, maybe even up to an f22, and that will give you your deep depth of field shot. So remember, the point of this is not to take the perfect photograph. The point of this is to take our cameras out, play around with the settings a little bit, and see what kind of images we come up with. That's the whole fun of photography. Well, I hope you'll be able to take your camera out this next month and practice some of these techniques. And I hope you come back next month because we're going to be learning about candlelight photography. I can't wait. For more information on this episode, go to our website and visit the Photography Guild show notes. Also, if you have any questions or ideas, send us an email. Thanks for watching.